Do we have, oh yeah, great, presentation, cool. So I have a lot of information that I want to go over, and there's a lot in here, so I might skip over a few things if it doesn't seem terribly interesting, or if you guys want to talk about something else. Okay, so this is the kind of stuff that I make. Very large costumes, very large props. I don't know how to sew, so I'm not really a cosplayer in that sense, but I do a lot of electronic work, and I do a lot of complicated full-size props, mostly from video games. So this is just a few examples, and I think that's all in English, and that doesn't help anybody. So yeah, I'm just going to go from here and just hope this turns out okay. First thing is, whenever you're going to be doing anything with props or anything with complicated tools or machinery, is safety. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about is dangerous to breathe or dangerous to have in your eyes, so gloves, respirator, goggles all the time. I do this every day, so for me it's very important. Okay, let's see. When I first started out, I only really had like a handful of things, so I'm going to kind of go over the basic stuff that most people should have when you're going to want to be making props. Some of this is pretty obvious, and some of it is, maybe less so. You don't need all of these, but certainly this is a good place to start. So a really sort of basic hand tool set is good to have. Hammer, screwdriver, pliers, scissors. What you see in the photo is pretty much all you're really ever going to need to make basic type props as far as hand tools are concerned. And actually, I have a lot of stuff to cover, so I'm going to go through these kind of quick, and if anybody has any questions later on, we can just talk about that. And so just one really quick point. X-Acto knives, probably most people who are comfortable or familiar with sewing will probably have this sort of stuff already. Rotary tools, Dremels are what most people have. The one on the bottom is a better version of a Dremel. But most people, again, with props, you can do almost anything with these. Sandpaper and files, this is very important because a lot of props end up looking very lumpy, and what you can do is spend a lot of time sanding, making sure everything is very smooth. And then something like a mouse sander will make that a lot faster, obviously. I have a bunch of different drills. You really only need one. I go through these pretty quickly because I tend to burn them out. And then hand saws. These will obviously take a very long time, but it's a cheap alternative to having like a power saw, like one of these. This is a jigsaw that'll basically cut through small material in straight edges and simple curves. And then clay sculpting tools. So if you're ever going to do anything that's got complex sort of organic shapes, you can make a lot of these by yourself out of some plasticware like spoons and such. Okay, some of these can get kind of expensive, so you don't necessarily need everything that I've got, but just a few of them will help out. Glue gun, anybody in cosplay has one of these already. And something that a lot of people overlook is clamps. So it's really, it makes things easier. You only have two hands, so if you need something to be held together without your two hands while you're working on it, I have tons of these, the more the better. Okay, a heat gun. Anybody who's ever worked with Worbla or Wonderflex probably uses one of these. You can maybe use a hairdryer, but a dedicated, very nice heat gun is nice to have instead. Okay, and then basically once you start getting all of those in your toolkit, you can start looking into advanced tools. Everything in here just does what everything I showed you already does, but faster or more precisely. Okay, again, safety. Most of what I'm about to show you is they're dangerous, very dangerous. I broke my finger once when a glove got caught in a bandsaw. Okay, so soldering irons, this is, if you're ever going to get into electronics, these can be very hot, very complicated, depending upon some of the different ones. The one on that side is simpler, and then the other two are more complicated for other different types of soldering. Okay, a drill press is just a much more complicated type of drill that you can do more precise holes with. Okay, and I'm going to show you like an example of what you can do with one of these tools. Okay, and this is, when I made my Daft Punk helmet, this is the little piece of plastic that held all of the lights. So drilling all of those by hand with a hand drill would be very difficult and imprecise, but with a drill press with lasers, it makes it a lot easier. A belt sander is obviously just a big sanding belt that makes things disappear a lot quicker than doing it by hand. And so this is a rifle stock that I made, and most of that was shaped on a belt sander. A bandsaw, like I said before, which I busted my finger on, this is just a really fast version of a coping saw or a scroll saw. So this is another version of, like an example of what you can cut with a bandsaw: long straight cuts, simple curves, that kind of thing. Okay, scroll saw is going to be for much more intricate and narrow small cuts. So if you're making really tight radius curves or cutting very, very small pieces, that's a good machine to have. A lathe is really useful for turning rounded shapes like this. And I also have a very large printer. One of the very useful things when you're making props is full-scale blueprints. The best thing about having a full-scale blueprint is you always have something to measure for when you're building later on. And taking measurements and making precise shapes is really a lot easier when you have something that's printed out full scale. I also made my own vacuum forming machines. One of these was just made out of an old toaster, and then the other one was a lot more complicated. Oh, okay, here, I'll show you. That's what a vacuum former does. It takes liquid, or it takes melted plastic, and you pull it over a shape, and then when you pull air out from underneath it, it makes that shape. So this is what my workshop looks like right now. And I didn't go out and buy everything in there in one day. Yeah, this was, I've been doing this for about 4 years, and when my workshop originally looked like this. So buy the tools that you need when you need them, because there's no need to buy a lathe vacuum forming machine if you're never going to use one. So I've got other things that I can talk about. I can talk about materials, or I can talk about painting, and then I've got like a brief little walkthrough of how I built one of my props. So what would you guys like to talk about? Because I don't want to run out of time. Oh, how I built something? Okay, well then I'm going to have to skip a whole bunch of stuff here. There we go. Alright, so this is how I made a pretty simple shield, actually. It's Cassandra's shield from Soul Calibur 4. So this is the blueprints that I made first, and I gathered a lot of reference images from the game and then created these in a program called Adobe Illustrator. Okay, and it's really important to do this as a first step, because you'll always have something to go back to later to make sure all your proportions and your angles and your dimensions are correct. Okay, so first off I started out by cutting this sort of basic shape just out of some thin MDF, which is particle board. So these were all stacked on top of each other, and I glued them together using a whole bunch of clamps with wood glue to make sure they were all one piece. Okay, the main sort of dome was made out of a type of foam called, this is going to be interesting, polystyrene foam. And I used, God, this is going to be difficult. I'm sorry, I used a material called urethane resin that goes on top of that to make a sort of hard shell, because the foam is very fragile, and this way you can sort of knock up against it and not dent it or scratch it. Okay, and you can see there were a lot of sort of cracks and divots from the foam, like places where it wasn't perfectly smooth. Okay, so that was followed up by a bunch of passes with Bondo, which is a polyester filler. The main sort of heart shape, you can see there's these little tabs along the inside. What I did was, after I printed out the full-scale piece, I cut the whole thing out first in paper. And then once I had the paper set out on top of that, I knew exactly where I needed to sculpt everything. And so this was all sculpted in a material called epoxy sculpt. Okay, and then there were more little details added in there with more epoxy sculpt. And you can see on the top all those sort of splotchy areas are more filler and Bondo and sanding. The top piece had a lot more sanding and painting to do as well. And after everything was ready to and finished, I painted the whole thing with a coat of primer. And primer is very important because that's what gets paint to stick to whatever you're making. So you shouldn't ever just take a prop and spray paint it with whatever color you want. You need primer on there to make sure that it stays put. Okay, that's just more primer. And then for some of the details on the back, I used my vacuum forming machine. So this was a piece that was trimmed on the lathe first, and then that's what it looks like after the plastic is formed around it. And that's it installed on the back of the shield. And the back piece there, the big white part, is a material called styrene plastic. Okay, and then after that I did all the paintwork to it. The reason that I didn't sculpt the main sort of silver heart shape first is so I could remove that paint and then install it later on. Okay, and then the last part that I think really makes props look better is weathering. And you can see in this shot everything's sort of nice and clean. And then here you can kind of see that everything's a little dirtier and dingier. And that kind of gives something a little bit more depth. It makes it look like a real item and not just a replica. And then that's the finished piece along with the sword and a few other pieces that I made for that costume.
Voilà la pièce terminée.
I can go back and talk about painting or materials now. I guess we have still a half an hour. Although materials might be a little difficult because I'm not sure that the things that I use in the States are available. So materials then, I guess people want to talk about materials.
Matériaux ou la peinture? Peinture.
Painting. Okay, painting it is. Well, that's good because I'm already here. So I spoke about weathering a little bit earlier with the shield, but I'll go over some ways on how to do that now. And so this is, you can see, a piece that is just in primer and then base coated with its colors and then finished and weathered. Weathering is what takes something and makes it look, transforms it from looking like a toy and makes it look like a real object. Okay, so I've got a couple of other examples. This is a piece before and after again.
Voici une pièce donc avant et après.
And then a few more examples.
D'autres exemples.
Okay, so most of the paint that I tend to use is really just 2 or 3 different types. I use enamels, acrylics, and sometimes I'll use lacquers. First thing that I'll sort of touch on is if you're doing any sort of resin casting, there's a lot of neat metallic fillers you can use. Well, yeah, on this piece over here, on the arm cuff, there's no paint on that yet. It's actually aluminum powder that was put in the plastic, and once you pull the part out, you can buff it and it will shine like real metal. And then on this piece over here, the rusted areas are iron filings that were dusted over the piece and then allowed to rust on their own. So it's actually real rust on a plastic helmet. A really handy thing to have whenever you're painting something is going to be a paint rack. Because if you're ever trying to paint something like a gun and you need to paint both sides of it, it's very annoying to paint one side, have to wait and let it dry, flip it over and paint the other side. So one of the first things I'll talk about for painting techniques is texturing. And you can get a whole bunch of really neat types of paints that will give you a textured appearance sort of straight out of the can. Okay, so the shield over there, the dark gray part is hammered textured paint, which a lot of people use in costuming because it's very durable and it makes that sort of neat sort of speckled finish. And then on the gun stock over here, I guess that's really kind of tough to see. Yeah, well, I made a texture that looks sort of like a grip by using a type of paint used for outdoor furniture. It's called Rust-Oleum multicolored textured paint, and you can spray paint over that with like a flat black, and it makes a really neat grip feel for pistols, firearms, gun props. Dry brushing is a technique that is used to accent edges on pieces to make them look worn and weathered as if they were sort of chipped off paint. And for this I get a little bit of enamel, silver enamel on a brush and wipe almost all of it off and then very lightly sort of scratch it against the edges of the piece. Antiquing is basically kind of the reverse of dry brushing, and that's specifically refers to how the letters were done on this piece. So in order to do that, I painted that center section gold first, allowed that to dry, and then painted brown over it. And then by sort of lightly sanding along the surface of the letters, it brought the gold back out. Decals are another way to make things look a lot more sort of realistic. There's several different types you can use. The first one on the upper left was just printed out on an inkjet printer. The M8 vinyl mask one is basically letters cut out of a piece of vinyl, and you paint over that, and then you remove it, and it leaves these behind. The water slide decals are basically something you would see on like a model kit. You can actually get those to run through an inkjet or a laser printer and then make anything you want. They only show up on light backgrounds though, so you can't put a water slide over, say, black. Like in a model kit, like for a model car, it's very similar. It's basically, okay, a water slide decal is basically a clear piece of plastic with an adhesive back on it. You put it in water and it comes off the backing, and then you slide it onto the car. Okay, my sort of favorite thing that I use for weathering something is a paper towel just soaked with brownish tinted paint. Okay, and basically if you sort of continually wipe that across the surface of the part, it will leave deposits of paint in the cracks and recesses, while clearing off and cleaning the areas on the top, making it look like the lower down parts of the proper dirt. And that's how you get sort of darker deposits behind something like this, where I'm not sure how well that's going to show up, but basically the parts in the back are darker than the parts in the front. I'll actually have these and a couple of other props outside. My little booth is right behind the auditorium, so if you guys want to come see these up close, they're out there. Okay, this is a really kind of weird thing to do, but a lot of people that want to make their props look very, very damaged will use things like mustard and ketchup. There's a way this works. What you do is you paint, for example, this prop, you would paint the whole thing silver, and then wherever you want silver scratches to show up, you would put mustard or ketchup, I've used hair gel in the past, onto those areas before painting the blue on. And so when the paint dries, it leaves a sort of blister over whatever stuff you put on there. And then you can scratch that off later on, and it leaves these sort of nice looking neat cutouts. And then another way to get some texture, this is from a friend of mine who made this. He actually dragged this around in his driveway to make it look scratched up and beaten up. So you can use stuff you've got around for texture. Okay, and once you're done with all of this, it's very important to clear coat the final part. A lot of acrylics and stuff can be very fragile, and to make sure that it lasts for a long time, clear coat's very important. So, for example, I've got a piece here that was painted with a bunch of different acrylic paints, and on its own, the acrylic would have been very sort of fragile, and you could rub all of this black area off with your finger. But after you've clear coated it, it makes it much more durable, so that you can make sure to take this to a con or something, and all your complicated weathering is not going to scratch off.
Have you worked for film sets? Have you done work for film sets?
I've worked on a fan film, and then I've done a couple of things for commercials, actually. One of these rifles was used in the live-action Mass Effect commercial that aired last year.
How long did it take to do one?
Oh, well, let's see. This piece here, I made in 8 days.
Donc cette pièce, il a fallu 8 jours.
These two, this sword and this shield, it took me about 4 weeks.
Donc le bouclier et l'épée 4 semaines.
A piece like this would take me about 2 weeks.
Une pièce comme le masque, à peu près 2 semaines.
And then I also made a very large Big Daddy costume, which took me 7 weeks.
Donc cette pièce lui a fallu 7 semaines.
So it really depends on scale, complexity, electronics. Yesterday was my first day off this year. I do this as a full-time job. I typically work 12 to 14 hours a day. Well, pricing varies. So it can, like a shield, like the one that I made, that one was $1,100 US. It was actually, I sort of fell into this by accident. I made a couple of costumes for Halloween once, and I went to a local convention, and a lot of people were like, hey, we really like the stuff that you made. And then I played Portal, and I made a Portal gun back in 2008, and I put it out on cosplay.com, and then overnight it got a whole bunch of attention, and then people started commissioning me for projects. I haven't gotten there yet. The question basically is how long did it take after I decided to do this as a full-time job before I was not eating just ramen and cheap food? The answer is I haven't gotten there yet. I've been doing this for about 4 years. I can pay all my bills, and I can keep myself from starving to death, and so far that's good enough for me. Copies, yeah. Actually, I've made several copies of lots of different props. The rifle I pulled out a minute ago, I've actually made 12 of those. And then typically that's a lot. I tend to...
Le plastique va après prendre la forme du moule. Hein? Thermoformage, d'accord.
Did they say fromage? Isn't that cheese?